Good morning. Please turn with me. Slow down. Already. Good morning. Please turn with me to Psalm 107 as we look at the subject this morning. Thanks and praise. Thanks and praise. Why? Because I've recalled going back through the lessons for the last couple of weeks, reviewing them, wincing often at some of the things I had said. Not necessarily because they were wrong, because they just came out weird. I started realizing, 107. Psalm 107, Psalm 107. So there are times in life you go back through your life, you get a chance to look at it. Sometimes you don't recall it the way it appears on tape. And so I get really interested, right? Being in the day of AI, and you see all these geniuses, and they're like, we're concerned about AI. We're concerned about AI. Why are they so concerned about AI? Well, if the geniuses are getting concerned about it, I get a little bit concerned about it too. When I start seeing these pictures of famous people, their mouth is moving, but stuff that's coming out is stuff they never said. Oh, but those times when I turn to something I might have actually said, and I wish that was an AI representation of what had happened, because, you never know now. All right, from week to week, I forget because I'm getting to that age where I don't necessarily remember what happened. And so when I was going back through some of my stuff, wishing that was some stuff that I hadn't said, I realized that I've been saying an awful lot in the way of thanks and praise as we were going through the Psalms without really taking the time to stop and talk about the significance of it. In my own ear, it began to sound redundant until I came on to Psalm 107, and I realized, wait a minute, there's a little bit of substance here in the whole concept of what thanks and praise has in terms of its significance for the psalmist in Psalm 107, where it begins, "Oh, give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. His steadfast love endures forever. Let the redeemed of the Lord say so, whom he has redeemed from trouble and gathered in from the lands, from the east and from the west, from the north and from the south." That whole concept of give thanks is followed up by this whole concept in verse 2 of the redeemed. And we've talked about that before. The concept of redemption for me goes back to times in my life when I realized, whether it is through no fault of my own or through every fault of my own, my life does not feel like it has the value that it should. I don't know if you've ever had a time in life where you just shook your head and said, there has to be something more to life than this. And so when I look at that whole concept of redemption, it is restoring value to a life that seems to have lost it for whatever reason. Why am I working this hard for this, whether it's money? Why am I going through all this toil for thankless effort, right? Fill in the blank. Why? And that whole concept of redemption, he is going to explain through 4 examples. Some where people just found a new opportunity through no sins of their own. The first example and the last example are going to be people who just had an opportunity. We're wandering in a situation where we just can't find a place to fit. I talk about misfits a lot. Why? Because if you feel like a misfit, which I sometimes do, it's easy to talk about not always feeling like you can find a place where you fit. And that's what he's going to talk about in the first example here. By the time he gets to the end, he's going to talk about more of an industrious type of individual who, no matter how hard you're working on legitimate things, it's one thing if I'm working on something and I know I got to look over my shoulder because I'm not sure this is the right thing to do. But that's not the case in the last example here, because you're doing what you're supposed to do here, and you're still struggling to wonder why. Why does it feel like this? He's going to redeem the time for you and give you a new opportunity to realize that as he says later on, Paul, I think, is going to say, your labor is not in vain. That's that concept of redemption, where you start to get it again. Where, I start to realize, wait a minute. This work isn't futile. I'm not doing this just because I got to get up and do it again. I get it again. This is why it matters. That's redemption. And that's what you're going to see in the last example in this chapter. Between the two, like we said, woe was me when those I hit play on those things, and no, I really did say that. I don't know, maybe it is AI. But I got to own it. And in the middle, there are going to be 2 examples where, I did that. But he's going to give me another chance anyway. He's going to say, in between these things, one of the reasons why it says, all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, it's even when I've done it. He's going to give me a chance to have my life feel like it has value again, whether it's my fault or not. Beginning in verse 4. Some wandered in desert wastes, finding no way to a city to dwell in, hungry and thirsty. Their soul fainted within them. They cried to the Lord in their trouble, and he delivered them from their distress. And he led them by a straight way, and they reached a city to dwell in. Let them thank the Lord for his steadfast love and his wondrous works to the children of man. There's a pattern that you're going to see in each of these sets of 4 examples of redemption. They're going to be so distressed that they, verse 6 here, cried out to the Lord in their time of trouble. He's going to deliver them, and they're going to remember. In this instance, verse 8, let them thank the Lord. Don't forget to thank God. Don't forget to thank God. Don't forget to thank God. It's going to be important by the time we get to the end of the chapter. But understand here, some wandered in desert wastes. There are times when, okay, it's obvious. Going back to Israel's history, even during a time of redemption, when they were delivered from Egypt, they had to wander for a while. Why? Because he could have probably taken them straight into the promised land, right? But it literally says he tested them almost as soon as they got out of the land of Egypt. Why? Because we've talked about it before, if I just keep giving you stuff, what are the chances that you're going to be thankful for very long? This is going to get old, maybe. And so we talked about that whole concept of slow down. No matter how much you love your kids, there comes that point where discipline has to step in. And so God understands being the perfect father. The whole picture of them coming out of Egypt is the same picture of the Christ. What happened with the Christ? Did he just bring him, oh, you're a king here, so let's just be royal there? No, he came to earth and he was born where? He would have a place in the inn for him. And so the same way he brought us a savior is the same way he started his nation. Through struggle. And so he brought them out to a place where they wanted. So when they had a home, they would understand how to appreciate it. Why? Because they were going to be kings too. We talked about it. We went through the history. Were they just going to be some random nation? No. They ended up being the greatest nation on earth. And so once he puts you in a position where you are actually the greatest, I need you to understand what it's like for people who are wandering and lost and looking for a place they can call home. And so it's not just about me providing you a place. It's who are you when I walk away and I go to do something else, because I'm not planning to be here to look over your shoulder the whole time, right? And so we love being his people, but the whole point of understanding what it's like to be his children is understanding it's like you're sending your young people off to here and there, whether it's going back to college or just going back to school, right? You're raising them for a time. You're not planning for them to stay with you forever. And so God willing, the growth of the joy in your relationship with them comes in the fact that you don't have to be there every time they're making a decision, to trust that the decisions they're making are ones that you, not only you, but everybody you see can hold their heads up about. So ultimately, it'd be great if you're just a proud mother and father. But we see it all the time. People who are proud of their kids and everybody else is like, are you kidding? Right? It's another thing when you raise your kids in a way where everybody, oh yeah, I know them. They want to name drop them too. You had nothing to do with raising this kid, but now you're trying to drop that name, right? Of course. Why? Because everybody's proud of what they're doing now. That's what Jesus wants to be able to say about us. And so when he's saying this whole concept of look at what I did in bringing my own son into this world. Look at what I did in establishing a nation. When I turned my back, understand that's who I want you to be to other people who are lost and wondering. We said, I don't need to say it before. We said it all going through all the law. We talked about pointing back to the law. Who are you supposed to be to those who are wandering into your midst, Israel, once I establish you as a nation? Who are you to be? David as a king. What's one of the things they noticed about David's reign? Oh, he was a mighty warrior. Yeah, that was what he did to subdue and get the kingdom. But we said it before, once you conquer, how are you going to run it? And David ran it with fairness and justice for everybody. Everyone. That's what he was known for. When you really get past the surface of the David and Goliath to understand what his kingdom was about. Part of the joy in living there was you didn't have to wonder what was going to happen when you walked into his courts. You didn't have to wonder about whether or not the person who was next to you knew David a little bit better than you did. You could trust that what was going to go on had everything to do with what actually happened. Not who had extra influence. And so when we're looking at this whole passage of, look, some wandered, verse 4, in the desert waste, finding no way to a city to dwell in, hungry and thirsty. What does that mean in Jesus' ministry? He says, blessed in the Beatitudes, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for food. No, everybody hungers and thirsts in food. That just makes you human. What makes you blessed? When you hunger and thirst for righteousness. And so in Psalm 107, understand, yeah, they may be hungry and thirsty for food, but that's everybody. But his people were people to whom he was giving a charge. Don't just be satisfied with what everybody else needs and looks for and strives for. That just makes you like everybody else. Sometimes it's good to be like everybody else if it makes you grow a heart for the human condition. But if that's all we want, we have to realize one of the reasons why we say it all the time, or I say it all the time, you want to pick good friends for your kids. You don't want them to just take on the behavior of everybody else. You want them to take on the behavior, the characteristics, and like we said, the habits, like we said before, of the kind of people who will make everybody want to name drop your kid. And so there's a time to have compassion for the common human experience, but then there's a time to say, no, you need to be exceptional. Why? Because you've been given that ability. You've been given an opportunity that not everybody has. You need to go back into it, but you understand one of the reasons why you want to put your kids in a certain environment. Talked about it before. Comps, when you're buying a house. Let's just buy one anywhere. Oh, good luck with that. Because there's some places where you can put your house is going to make it tougher for you to raise your kids in a way that will make you hold your head up. And so ultimately you understand one of the reasons why you care so much about the environment in which you raise your kids is because you want them to basically beyond simply having food to eat and something to satisfy their thirst. You want them to want more in terms of their character. Why does that matter? Why does that matter? Because even if you find a great place to live, Jeremiah 9, it's still not enough. How do we know? Let's look at God's reaction to where Israel had fallen in Jeremiah 9. Oh, that my head were waters and my eyes a fountain of tears, that I might weep day and night for the slain of the daughter of my people. Oh, that I had in the desert a traveler's lodging place, that I might leave my people and go away from them. For they are all adulterers, a company of treacherous men. They bend their tongue like a bow. Falsehood and not truth has grown strong in the land. For they proceed from evil to evil, and they do not know me, declares Jeremiah, but declares the Lord. Declares the Lord. And now you turn back to where we are. We've gone from a place where he's talking about giving comfort to those who are wandering, to God saying, like David, we've seen in the previous song, if I could just fly away from here. He didn't say, build me another temple with another people. He just wants a place in the desert. Can I just get a tent in the desert again, back when I was living in that tabernacle? That sounds real good compared to what's going on in this temple right now, where it's hard to find somebody who just tell you the truth. And so when he's looking at that whole concept, understand, even when we found a place to rest, that's not the end of it. See, because sometimes our soul can wander when we're sitting right in front of our couch, in front of our TV, wishing for a genuine place of peace. Because for whatever reason, it's not here in my home. And so understand, even when I found it, there can still be something missing. And that is what he is redeeming in this individual. See, because when I give you the home, even if I make you a king in that castle, or I make you the greatest nation on earth, are you going to be able, as we've said before, are you going to be able to maintain it? Are you going to be able to maintain it? Or are you going to handle it in such a way where you finally have a nice place to stay and peace does not dwell there because of the habits you've allowed to develop inside the home that you were given? How do we know? Because if you keep going on to verse 10, some sat in darkness and in the shadow of death, prisoners in affliction and in irons, for they had rebelled against the words of God and spurned the counsel of the Most High. So he bowed their hearts down with hard labor. They fell down with none to help. Same pattern, verse 13. They cried to the Lord in their trouble, same pattern, and he delivered them from their distress. He brought them out of darkness and the shadow of death and burst their bonds apart. Same pattern, verse 15. Let them thank the Lord for his steadfast love, for his wondrous works to the children of man. Understand? Now we're in that section. Now you got the house. What are you going to do with it? I made some bad choices, right? One of my favorite rappers says it like this. Okay, just say quick what he says. But ultimately, he goes on to talk about, times in his life when God has restored him. He's righted the car. He uses it as a metaphor. And as soon as the car starts moving straight down the road again, he wants, I got it, God. I used that metaphor before. He wants to take the steering wheel. Oh, that reminded me of what's going on in this chapter. Where God's finally given our protagonist, we'll call him, a place to stay. And now that things are going well, they want to grab the steering wheel. They want to be Siri, whether or not they know where they're going. Sometimes just it's fun. Make my own decisions. Don't we celebrate it? We talk about it all the time. Freedom, land of the free, the home of the brave. We talked about it. We have those rights here in America. That's a blessing. Oh, but God is saying you got to be mature with it. Because even in a situation where people give you your freedoms, the question is, have they also given you the freedom to self-destruct? And that's literally what's going on in this passage. Because the person has said, well, God's cool. I like him. He's got some great ideas, but so do I. And he's saying those great ideas will inevitably lead us all to the same place. Oh no, we might not all end up in the same city. It's a big wide world. I might end up overseas again. You might end up in such and such. But we'll all end up in the same spiritual place if we take control of the wheel and decide we can mix what he's called us to do, he's going to call it here his counsel, with some of our bright ideas. It won't matter where we're living if we're all living in a place where eventually he lets us get to, that's why, what does it say again? Some sat in verse 10, darkness and the shadow of death, prisoners in affliction in irons. If we are all in that same mindset, how did I get here? How did I get here? How did I get here? Older, wiser preacher I talked to one time, pulled out just a chalkboard, empty chalkboard, picked up a piece of chalk, and drew I can't remember what he drew first. I think he drew a line. And eventually at the end of that line, he drew a hook. And then he drew a fish. And of course, you probably know the illustration if you've been in the churches of Christ for very long. At the end of that hook, and between that hook and that fish, he drew a worm. He said something like, wouldn't it be neat if every time that fish was staring at that worm, that hook was obvious? And he had an idea. That's a hook. That's not good to eat because I might want that worm. But that hook, there's something else going on that I really need to be careful of. But ultimately, he said, it's not that easy because if you are a decent fisherman, you hide the hook. That's why they call it a lure. You don't make it so obvious. And so understand, if we get it, the enemy understands as well. The way to our hearts, the old adage used to be, say, the way to a man's heart is through his stomach. Well, one thing we share in common as men and women is Satan understands the way to our hearts is through our stomachs. And so he offers to feed us. I'm making it up. Okay, go ask Eve. Thank you. Right? What did he lure her in with? Something that was on the tree, right? Yeah. And go to the very end. One of my dead horse verses is in Philippians, what's it, 3 or 4? Paul laments. It sounds like he's lamenting in the church. He says their God is their belly. He's also going to talk to, I think it's the church, he's going to talk to Timothy. 1 Timothy, he's going to say, a widow who is self-indulgent? What's it going to say? That's another word for her appetite. It literally says she's dead while she's living. And so they lament over and over again the way that the enemy draws us in through our appetites. And so understand, when I'm looking at this in this perspective, from this perspective in verses 10 through 15, at that whole concept of I can eat whatever I want, whenever I want, blah, blah, blah. Well, see, we get it in terms of diet. I talked about Zion Williamson last week, and he's understanding the downside of eating whatever he wants and still trying to be a professional athlete. That's one thing. But this situation is one in which even if you have it completely dialed in, okay, I need to be healthy, I need to do this, there are certain things that God is saying you need to stay away from and you need to maybe consider a little bit more of if you genuinely want to be healthy. we look at it from the perspective of foods, we can look at it from the perspective of fad diets. Even if I decide I want to get myself in shape, is every diet you see advertised on YouTube, I don't know what your feed looks like, but there are a whole lot of diets that look really good on the front end, but if you don't really look at them in detail, then you're going to be wasting your time. You're going to be trying to starve yourself for things you actually do need, right? Because we're simple people. Who has time to go to work all the time and take care of what you need to take care of and know everything you need to know about health and nutrition? Good luck with that. That's just one example. I don't need to just feed my body in a healthy way. I got to know how to balance my money. I got to know how to do this. I got to know how to do that. And there's so many, you can't know everything. And so when he talks about those who spurn my counsel, understand. It's one thing to not be a child of God, but we've said it before. If you actually believe that God is, one of the things that Paul warns about is in the end times, there are going to be people, let me slow down. I don't want to put it in terms of those people versus me or us. We're going to be tempted to acknowledge that there is a God without acknowledging his power. The thing I like about this verse is it's talking about his power to counsel us in ways beyond our understanding. So when we look at it from the perspective of choices, we have the choice to do whatever we want, but it goes back to this whole concept of Psalm 19 when it talks about God, keep me back from presumptuous sins, presuming that I can find the right mix of your wisdom and my wisdom that's going to keep me from this place of affliction. But the great thing about this passage, as we said, is this is not a passage of condemnation because he's still redeeming us in times when we have drifted into some mix of what seemed good to us and what seemed, okay, good to take from God. And we found that whether or not we're connecting the dots, whatever we have done, we're realizing that we've fallen once again in a place where there has to be something more than this. Give thanks when he gives you another opportunity to get out of times when you realize the fact is there's probably something that I've done that's left me with this feeling that there has to be something more than this. Verse 17 is going to be another way he talks about we can fall into that feeling. Some were fools through their sinful ways and became of their iniquities, and because of their iniquities suffered affliction. They loathed any kind of food and they drew near to the gates of death. They cried out to the Lord in their trouble, some familiar pattern, and he delivered them from their distress. He sent out his word and healed them and delivered them from their destruction. Let them thank the Lord for his steadfast love, for his wondrous works to the children of man, and let them offer sacrifices of thanksgiving and tell of his deeds in songs of joy. Understand, it's not simply the whole concept of wandering off under my own wisdom. This, for whatever reason, this passage reminded me of that whole concept of in Ecclesiastes, Solomon saying, even as a wise man, even as the wisest man, there are times when you can look up from the top of the mountain, having everything you need, and realize, well, is this all there is? So turn with me to Ecclesiastes 2 to understand a little bit of what that looked like for Solomon. I said in my heart, come now, I will test you with pleasure. Enjoy yourself. But behold, this also was vanity. I said of laughter, it is mad. And of pleasure, what use is it? I searched with my heart how to cheer my body with wine. My heart still guiding me with wisdom, and how to lay hold on folly, till I might see what was good for the children of man to do under heaven during the few days of their life. I made great works. I built houses and planted vineyards for myself. I made myself gardens and parks. I planted them with all kinds of fruit trees. I made myself pools from which to water the forest of growing trees. I bought male and female slaves and had slaves who were born in my house. I also had great possessions of herds and flocks, more than any who had been before me in Jerusalem. I also gathered for myself silver and gold and the treasure of kings and provinces. I got singers, both men and women, and many concubines, the delight of the children of men. So I became great and surpassed all who were before me in Jerusalem. Also my wisdom remained with me, and whatever my eyes desired, I did not keep from them. I kept my heart from no pleasure, for my heart found pleasure in all my toil. and this was my reward for all my toil. Then I considered all that my hands had done, and the toil I had expended in doing it. And behold, all was vanity, and a striving after wind, and there was nothing else to be gained under the sun. Would you please turn back with me to Psalm 107? Understand, of course, I emphasize different parts of the reading. It's because in this time, we're looking at those verses 17 through 22 in Psalm 107. It talks about verse 17. Some were fools through their sinful ways. We're living in a time where, once again, we said the great part of freedom is being able to do whatever you want. But the downside of freedom is losing your sense of purpose. And so even the wisest man, Solomon, when he indulged folly and he lost sense of why God had made him the king, he did so much in pursuit of making himself happy that he made himself miserable. Why is that? Because when I am in pursuit of that worm, as we talked about on the hook, when I get fixated on that being my particular source of sustenance, I lose sight of the fact that, wait a minute, that's not the only worm out there. That's just the one that's in my face. And so that's so often what the enemy does. He hides his hook in a convenient meal. And so Solomon said, I'm not going to deny myself anything that seems convenient or fun or easy. I'm going to indulge in it all. And the hook was that in that was still this feeling of emptiness and vanity. He didn't realize that for whatever reason, God had told him not only the way that he could be a king and a righteous man to the people of Israel, but he lost sight of the way in which he really needed the people of Israel for him to feel whole as a man. You understand it in your family, right? One of the values in having a family is having the love of the people around you. One of the values in having friends is having the love of the friends around you. At its best, it's reciprocity. And so what happens here is a situation where folly says you don't have to care about the people around you. But wisdom says if you neglect them for very long, they won't be there for very long. Understand in Samson, if we go back to the previous set of verses, in verses 10, some sat in the darkness and the shadow of death. Samson was a man who was known for having the strength to be able to do whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted. And ultimately, he was wise to what Delilah was trying to do to him, right? She didn't fool him. He just spent so much time around the worm. The fact that his flesh was being satisfied by Delilah, that he was eventually overwhelmed even in his wisdom. That's two men who weren't fooled, but were overwhelmed because they spent so much time around the bait that eventually it just became to be like, well, maybe just if I take a nibble, maybe just a bit, well, it won't hurt. If I just tell her my secret, she'll stop nagging Samson, right? And so ultimately understand that we are placed in a body where no matter how wise we get, we talked about it before, the enemy has been at this for so long that he knows if he just leaves it right there long enough, he knows we'll get hungry. And so ultimately, he's saying that even when you have taken that hook, the beauty is 19, cry out to the Lord in your time of trouble, and he still may be willing to deliver you. But don't forget, verse 21, thank him. Why? Because as we go into the last set of verses, verse 23, some went down to the sea in ships, doing business on the great waters. They saw the deeds of the Lord, his wondrous works in the deep. For they commanded, and he raised a stormy wind, which lifted up the waves of the sea. They mounted up to heaven. They went down to the depths. Their courage melted away. And they were at their courage melted away in their evil plight. They reeled and staggered like drunken men and were at their, famous quote, wit's end. Same pattern, verse 28. Then they cried out to the Lord in their trouble, and he delivered them from their distress. He made the storm be still, and the waves of the sea were hushed. Then they were glad that the waters were quiet, and he brought them to their desired haven. Let them thank the Lord for his steadfast love, for his wondrous works to the children of man. Let them extol him in the congregation of the people, and praise him in the assembly of the elders. As we said before, this is a circumstance where they're just doing business. They're doing what they're supposed to do, and life simply brings them, this passage describes as evil circumstances. Once again, the whole concept of wisdom, if we look at Solomon, doesn't matter because there are going to be circumstances where you are going to be at your wit's end. And so ultimately, if there's a situation that brings you to your wit's end, we've said it before, the natural response is to be like, what am I going to do? But if you come into enough circumstances where you are at your wit's end, God willing, as the people of God, we will begin to say, I'm not sure that matters, because this is simply another opportunity for me to ask God, what are we going to do next? And so I mentioned it because this isn't the first time I preached Psalm 107 here. Last time I preached it, one of the things we talked about was this whole concept of a friend that I had a chance to talk to over the holiday season again. And we were talking about this whole concept of, why is God bringing me through this again? Why is he bringing me through this again? Is it me in these two middle sets of chapters where I'm just making bad choices, or I'm being super self-indulgent and he's trying to discipline me? Or, as we talked, is it another situation? One where, as we mentioned, he's simply trying to build up what we call muscle memory. Certain people tell you muscle memory isn't a thing, but conditioning is. And one of the reasons why conditioning is so important is it creates in you, as our brother mentioned, the need to not have to restart every time you make simple decisions and going through that process all over again. It gives you what we call a heuristic. It gives you something you can rely on. I've been here before, and I know how to react in this situation. And so in this circumstance where he's come to his, or she has come to her wit's end, if you start to feel like, why am I constantly going through this circumstance where I'm at my wit's end? It's not so much God trying to idly humble you and make you feel like you're inadequate, as much as he is trying to make it your natural response to feel comfortable at a point where you just don't know what to do. The point where you will trust him that as he is carried through in each of these circumstances, whether or not it is you feeling like a misfit, trying to find a home, or feeling like a misfit in your home, you feeling like you're trying to bounce back from decisions that you just rather have back again, or whether or not you have been so self-indulgent that you're starting to realize that there's still no joy in this either. The bottom line is he's saying at every turn, as our brother Don mentioned, as we go into a new year, each new day affords you a new opportunity to realize that God is still willing to redeem whatever it is that your life seems to have come to. As we go towards the end in verses 33 to the end of the chapter, why is that important? It's going to be because in verse 33, he turns rivers into a desert, springs of water into thirsty ground, a fruitful land into a salty waste, because of the evil of its inhabitants. But in verse 35, he turns a desert into pools of water, a parched land into springs of water, and there he lets the hungry dwell. And they establish a city to live in, and they sow fields and plant vineyards, and they get fruitful yield. By his blessing they multiply greatly, and he does not let their livestock diminish. When they are diminished and brought low through oppression, evil, and sorrow, he pours contempt on princes, and makes them wander in tactless places. Right? And makes them wander in tactless wastes. But he raises up the needy out of affliction, and makes their families like flocks. The upright see it and are glad, and all wickedness shuts its mouth. Whoever is wise, let him attend to these things. Let him consider the steadfast love of the Lord. Ultimately, no matter where God has brought us to at the end of 2023, whether you're in a great place or in a place where you just know I could be doing better, this whole concept of he turns in the first couple of verses, verse 33, he turns good things into disappointment in 33 and 34. But he turns in verse 35 and 36, disappointment into opportunities. It reminded me of another passage from Solomon's life, a story I've read before, but I'm going to read it again because I found it in a couple of different perspectives. It goes this way. What did Abraham Lincoln and Ben Ishi from Baghdad have in common? It turns out to be a special fondness for ancient Jewish folktale, which goes like this. King Solomon once searched for a cure against depression. He assembled his wise men together. They meditated for a long time and gave to him the following advice. Make for yourself a ring, and thereon engraved have the words written. This too will pass. The king carried out the advice. He had the ring made and wore it constantly. Every time he felt sad and depressed, he looked at the ring, whereon his mood would change and he would feel cheerful. The other version that I read before goes on to say that ring doesn't always talk about bad times, turned around by the realization that this too shall pass. But the other side is that, much like this passage warns us, God's deeper wisdom is that even if God has turned things around for us and put us in a place where we once again feel like our lives have meaning, understand that the only key to enduring happiness in 2024 and beyond is understanding that this too shall pass if God has not established the peace that we have. Turning back to Psalm 89. Psalm 89. That all reminded me of this. David, where God was talking about his relationship with David, or the psalmist is talking about God's relationship with David. It's going to say in verse 20 of Psalm 89, I found David my servant, and with my holy oil I have anointed him, so that my hand shall be established with him. My arm also shall strengthen him. Verse 29, I will establish his offspring forever, and his throne as the days of heaven. If his children forsake my law and do not walk according to my rules, if they violate my statutes and do not keep my commandments, then I will punish their transgressions with the rod and their iniquity with stripes. But I will not remove from him my steadfast love or be false with my faithfulness. That was the encouragement for me in Psalm 107. It's understanding that once again, the whole concept of having God establish the redemption of my 2023, of whatever led me up to this point. It goes back to the whole concept we talked about before. It's all fleeting. Something God can turn either way unless we allow him to instill in us the kind of character that allows him to simply establish us as a people who are dwelling in 2024 and beyond, as a place or people that are headed for an eternal peace. Understand that as I leave you, I often say my prayer for you is my prayer for me. That wherever our paths take us, whether it is in life to see each other again, and God willing possibly work together, partner together again on this plane, or to not necessarily see each other again until we reach the other side. My prayer is that we actually see one another in peace, because we allowed God to develop in us the kind of character that beyond a New Year's resolution said, these are the kind of people who I don't have to worry about when my back is turned. These are the kind of people who I am proud to call my own. And these are the kind of people who I want to be with me in eternity. So my prayer for you is my prayer for me. As we depart here today on this Sunday, and we look back at Psalm 107. As the kind of psalm that reminds us of why thanks is the kind of thing that puts us all on that road. See, because as his disciple, one of the things I began to realize is that as I move forward in gratitude is one of those things that keeps me anchored in understanding that no matter how much God has given me, whether it's a second chance, a new opportunity, all the things that I might have ever dreamed of. It's like that relationship that we talked about, it's symbolized by the love bank. It makes no sense for me to constantly get the things that God is willing to give me if all I'm doing is deteriorating the relationship that I have with him. Ultimately, when I am mired in thanks, when everything I do is locked into giving God thanksgiving, or giving God thanks for what he has done for me. What it does is it helps me realize that as the giver, he has a certain hope, as we mentioned before, for what I will do with the blessings. And the more I thank him, the more I stay in tune with the purpose for the blessings that he's given me. The more I realize that I can go forward in whatever direction I want. But if I'm like Solomon and all I'm doing is searching for myself, different opportunities, different things that satisfy nothing more than my own appetite, then over time, it's much like we mentioned with regard to the law. When Israel was brought out of Egypt, and God was giving them over and over the things that would satisfy their cravings, one of the things that they lost sight of through refusing to offer thanks to God was the way that they were deteriorating their relationship with the giver. So my prayer for you is my prayer for me, that we end up walking the kind of path that will allow us all to see God in peace, because in giving thanks, we stay in touch with the relationship we have with the giver, even beyond simply being grateful for the things that he's given us. God's best to you as you go forward in him.
Let's all stand.